Good evening and welcome to our Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection Book Talk. We're happy you could join us. This evening we are discussing Reclaiming the Great World House, the Global Vision of Martin Luther King Jr., which I co-edited along with Dr. Louis V. Baldwin, Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University. This book is one of 4 in the Morehouse College King Collection series on civil and human rights, published in 2019 through the University of Georgia Press. First, I would like to introduce 4 of the contributors to this volume who are here with us this evening before providing an overview of the book's conceptual framework and overall theme. Following this, the contributors will each provide a brief discussion of their chapters, beginning with Dr. Hak Joon Lee, followed by Dr. Larry Rivers, Dr. Crystal de Gregory, and Dr. Louis Baldwin, in that order. Finally, after these presentations, I will pose a few questions to our contributors. If you have questions, please send them by email to kingcollection@morehouse.edu. That's King Collection, KINGCOLLECTION, one word, at morehouse.edu. Or you can put your questions in the YouTube chat box. Now to introduce our contributors. Dr. Hak Joon Lee is Professor of Christian Ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary. Dr. Lee's research focuses on global ethics, public theology, and Asian American theology. Dr. Lee has centered much of his attention around the ethics and spirituality of Martin Luther King Jr. and has published numerous monographs, including God and Community Organizing, The Great World House, Martin Luther King Jr., and Global Ethics, and We Will Get to the Promised Land, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Communal Political Spirituality. Dr. Larry Rivers is Associate Professor of History at the University of West Georgia. His articles have appeared in the Florida Historical Quarterly and the Journal of African American History. He has also contributed chapters to several books published by the University of Georgia Press and the University of Florida Press. Dr. Rivers is currently writing a biography of the late Reverend James Hudson, an unsung hero of the civil rights movement, which is under advance contract with the University of Florida Press. Dr. Crystal de Gregory is a nationally known historian and storyteller whose current research interests include Black higher education and college student activism. Presently, Dr. de Gregory is a research fellow at Middle Tennessee State University's Center for Historic Preservation, where she is the founder and editor of 2 digital storytelling projects. She is a much sought-after speaker on African American history, where she addresses issues involving race, women and girls, and Black history and culture. She holds a PhD degree in history from Vanderbilt University and is a proud native of the Bahamas. And finally, Dr. Louis V. Baldwin is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University, where he retired after serving 30 years. He is a nationally and internationally recognized King scholar and professor, having written over a dozen books on Dr. King and more than 60 scholarly articles and chapters in books. Among his many publications are several groundbreaking studies, such as There is a Balm in Gilead, The Cultural Roots of Martin Luther King Jr., and Toward the Beloved Community, Martin Luther King Jr. and South Africa, and In a Single Garment of Destiny, A Vision of Global Justice. Dr. Baldwin is an ordained Baptist minister and native of Camden, Alabama, where he actively participated in the civil rights and Black Power movements. He has a wealth of experience teaching at the college, university, divinity, and seminary levels since the 1970s. Reclaiming the Great World House, the Global Vision of Martin Luther King Jr. is a collective project with several scholars contributing to the volume. We represent a group of established as well as emerging King scholars who approach the study of Kingian ideas from varying multidisciplinary perspectives. We are diverse by race, gender, nationality, and generation. Since beginning this project over 7 years ago, I am sorry to say that we have lost one of our contributors who recently passed away, Dr. Rufus Burrell, eminent professor of theological thought and social ethics at Christian Theological Seminary. Reclaiming the Great World House seeks to examine Dr. King as a global figure, one who felt a moral obligation to speak and act against injustice worldwide, and who supported human rights struggles both at home and around the world. The book centers around King's concept of the Great World House, an ideal he articulated widely, especially during the last 5 years of his life. The term Great World House represents King's all-inclusive vision for humanity and his thinking about the interconnectedness of the human experience, that we are one human family, regardless of one's race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, gender, sexual identity, or culture and nationality. It's the idea expressed in a letter from Birmingham jail when King writes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. In one of his last books, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, published shortly before his death, Dr. King devoted an entire chapter to the World House. He begins that chapter using a metaphor of a large house that has been inherited by a family that cannot get along. King writes that, quote, "This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a large house, a great world house in which we have to live together, Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu. A family that is unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace." In this chapter, Dr. King goes on to write that just living in the World House is threatened by the moral imperatives of the times, namely threats to peaceful living, which include what he called the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, along with violence and human destruction. Writing over 50 years ago, his final words in this chapter were these: "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. We still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos or community," end quote. It was this final chapter from King's historical book that served as an important point of entry for our contemporary exploration of his ideas and how they might be reclaimed and reimagined in our time. Now I would like to turn to Dr. Hak Joon Lee to discuss King's global ethics. Dr. Lee will be followed by Dr. Larry Rivers, who will then examine King's critique of racism and white supremacy.
Greetings. It is my pleasure to be part of this panel with esteemed scholars of King studies. Thank you, Dr. Crawford and Morehouse College, for your warm invitation. The title of my chapter is "The World as a Single Neighborhood: The Global Ethics of Martin Luther King Jr." In this chapter, I present King's ethics as a constructive resource for global ethics, called Kingian Global Ethics. Assuming some of you may not be familiar with global ethics, let me briefly explain what it is and how it is related to Dr. King. First introduced by a Catholic theologian Hans Kung in 1989, global ethics is an emerging discipline in Christian ethics that addresses various crises that globalization poses. Its aim is to protect and promote the sanctity and the common good of humanity and the planet by establishing globally shared moral values and standards. Its core assumption is that humans share certain moral norms and standards, regardless of their religious and cultural background, and that keeping these norms and standards are necessary for the survival of humanity today. In short, global ethics seeks the globalization of ethics in order to address global crises. While King never used the term global ethics, I claim his ethics is rich with creative ideas, insights to serve as the resources for constructive global ethics today. Dr. King's public ministry took place in the context of the emerging globalization, namely the post-World War II era, when the United Nations and other international bodies were established to prevent another major war, and when liberation movements were spreading across the majority world. Dr. King tied African American struggles to this movement and strategically used this new globalizing reality for the benefit of his movement. As Dr. Crawford mentioned, King's movements against racism, classism, and militarism had a global scope and impetus. However, Dr. King went far further than his contemporaries in dealing with this new emerging reality of globalization. In fact, King was probably one of only a few people who genuinely understood both the promises and the threats of globalization. Dr. King noted, for example, quote, "The large house in which we live demands that we transform this worldwide neighborhood into worldwide brotherhood. Together we must learn to live as brothers, or together we will be forced to perish as fools," end quote. Dr. King saw this discrepancy between neighborhood and brotherhood as a major threat for humanity. Hence, without an appropriate ethics that guide and bind humanity together, the world would be on a self-destructive path. Out of this fierce urgency, Dr. King called for the revolutionary transformation of values. Now let's move to Dr. King's ethics. Dr. King's ethics epitomized his vision of the Great World House, responds to this historical challenge. King's ethics has 4 components: vision, political practice, namely nonviolent resistance, norms, such as human dignity, justice, love, peace, and finally virtues, such as fortitude, forbearance, practical wisdom, and hope. These 4 components are coherent, balanced, and complementary with each other. Together, they provide a motivating force, concrete directives and means for actions and social changes, and the formation of moral agents. While the vision of a world house evokes noble human desires for the common good by pulling and holding people together, political practices of nonviolence offer the tools in dismantling injustice that frustrate the vision of a world house. On the other hand, norms offer moral reference points for our decisions and actions. Finally, virtues are necessary for individuals to pursue their life goals in the context of the Great World House and norms that humanity share together. These virtues are formed when persons pursue the vision and practice the norms in their lives. In his public ministry, King never separated these 4 components. Thanks to this holistic and balanced approach, King's ethics makes distinctive contributions to the current global ethics project by addressing some of its limitations, especially the gap between the global and the local, between theory and practice. First, the current global ethics project tends to be more global than local, more theoretical than practical. Advocated mostly by intellectuals and some leading politicians of the West, the current project tends to be an elitist, that is a top-down approach. And it is a minimalist in its orientation because it aims to secure the consensus on Beijing norms and standards that transcend religious and cultural differences. Consequently, global ethics is felt distanced from local communities and their religious cultural traditions, which still exercise major forces in the moral decisions and actions of local people. Second, global ethics faced a challenge in implementing the global norms and values in actual realities, even after their international ratifications. Achieving global peace and justice requires correcting the abuses and misuses of power by the rich and the powerful. However, the rich and powerful seldom voluntarily give up their power and privilege, but rather use them to protect, expand their self-interest. Therefore, the dismantling of global injustices requires persistent collective actions in addition to moral persuasion, which the current global ethics projects mostly focus on. King's ethics is different from the current project of global ethics, despite its shared global scope and goal with the project. First, King's ethics takes a bottom-up approach. It is not an elitist either. His ethics, in fact, emerged from his local movements rather than theoretical discussions. King's advocacy of global moral vision and values was rooted in a deep local religious tradition, namely African American Christianity. Second, King's ethics takes power analysis seriously. He identified the imbalance of power as a major cause of injustices, and he emphasized the necessity of grassroots organizing and collective actions to rectify injustices. Most importantly, King himself was a practitioner of global ethics who lived out its vision and norms through his organizing work, coalition building, and nonviolent resistance. And his movement present actual examples of how global ethics can be practiced. In short, unlike the current project of global ethics today, King's ethics maintains the dialectic balance between global and local, between theory and practice. Thanks to the organic balance and holistic nature, King's ethics has been effective in mobilizing people for social changes. And it explains why his example has inspired the numerous liberation and human rights movement in the world, even after his death. Inspired by Dr. King, many different peoples have applied his ethics, either part or whole, to their own context and distinctive issues, even those ones that King himself did not publicly engage, most notably sexism, homophobia, ecological injustices. These historical records demonstrate the capaciousness and ongoing relevance of King's ethics. The world is globalized to the extent it shapes our daily lives. The crisis that humanity faces today, the pandemic, nuclear threat, climate change, and the international terrorism, to name the few, are the global in nature. The COVID-19 crisis exemplifies the necessity of global ethics in a most painful way. These crises cannot be solved by one nation, religion, or race alone. We need to put our ecumenical loyalties above tribal and sectional ones. King's concern about the threats of a globalizing world has become reality today. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? The question Dr. King asked in his last book has become an existential one for us. In fact, humanity is now forced to choose between chaos and community, survival of the fittest, and the beautiful world house. More than any other time in human history, the entire humanity needs a genuine revolution of values for its own survival. In this aspect, Dr. King, even after more than 50 years of his death, still shows us the vision and the way for humanity, and his ethics offers the precious resources in charting our path in this turbulent and dangerous time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you. Now we will turn to Dr. Larry Rivers.
My chapter has the title, The Scourge of the Color Bar, Racism as a Barrier to Human Community. Today, the words racism, and especially racist, are seen as very loaded terms. So it is helpful to begin with a definition of a racist idea. A succinct definition comes from a scholar who I knew when we were both students in the Florida A&M University School of Journalism and Graphic Communication, Dr. Ibram Kendi. Dr. Kendi wrote in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America that, and I quote, "My definition of a racist idea is a simple one. It is any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way," unquote. One reason that definition is very helpful is because while we don't hear as many people today arguing that a racial group is biologically inferior, it is still all too common to hear arguments suggesting that certain racial groups are culturally inferior. The concept of cultural racial inferiority is just as racist as the concept of biological racial inferiority. My chapter explores how Dr. King saw racist ideas and actions derived from racist ideas as impediments to human community. The chapter begins with a quote from Dr. King's 1967 book, Where Did We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? In the quote, Dr. King said, and I quote, "Racism is total estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and spirits. Inevitably, it descends to inflicting spiritual or physical homicide upon the outgroup." So here we see Dr. King connecting the internal act of harboring racist ideas to the eventual external acts of spiritual and or physical violence. As Dr. Richard W. Wills Sr. has observed, and I quote again, "Violence was seen by King as the antithesis of community." Early in my chapter, I talk about how King expressed his view of the concept of community from a philosophical vantage point. In writing this section, I owe a great debt to my graduate school training. During spring 2006, as a PhD student in history at Vanderbilt University, I enrolled in Dr. Lewis B. Baldwin's course on Martin Luther King Jr. and the social roles of religion. Another student in that class was my student mentor, Dr. Crystal de Gregory. Dr. Baldwin emphasized in that class the importance of understanding King's use of philosophy, particularly the philosophy of personalism, which Dr. King described as, quote, "my basic philosophical position." This importance of understanding personalism was further emphasized to me in the directed reading class that I took from my PhD advisor, Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson. After graduate school, I was further blessed to correspond with the late Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr., another contributor to our book, who was a leading authority on personalism. And so from that, I can describe that at the lay level, personalism is the belief that all human life is created in God's image and therefore has dignity, value, and a fraternal linkage. What laypersons might call the soul, personalist philosophers call personality. That is, self-conscious experience capable of rational thought and moral judgment. Personalist scholars considered personality to be the most useful clue toward understanding reality. That which contains personality is a person, according to personalistic philosophers. Dr. King was a theistic personalist. He viewed existence as a community of interdependent human persons within God, the supreme person. Dr. King also believed that God had established an objective moral order. That objective moral order was a system of moral laws that God had set in place, along with the objective physical order that included the law of gravity and other laws. Racism in Dr. King's eyes was a man-made division that stood in conflict with the system of moral laws that God had established. Racism obstructed the Lord's children from living like brothers and sisters in the manner that God had intended. Thus, Dr. King's ministry confronted racism as part of its mission to challenge that which impeded social facts from aligning with spiritual realities. Globally, Dr. King saw imperialism or empire building, as well as apartheid, as racist structures that threaten the world house. My chapter contextualizes and explores this topic in 4 sections. The first section examines how the roots of King's conceptualization of racism as an internationally corrosive social vice extended to his upbringing. The second section looks at how King confronted some of his own internalized racism and how he came to oppose cultural imperialism, a powerful tool of racism. The third section discusses King's denunciation of Western imperialism throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The fourth section details King's arguments against South African apartheid, which he called, quote, a policy of organized racism. Toward the end of the chapter, I quote from a story that Harry Belafonte has told about one of his conversations with King. I first heard Belafonte tell this story in 2008 when he delivered the keynote talk for Vanderbilt University's Martin Luther King Jr. Commemorative Series for that year. Belafonte recalled that, quote, midway through the civil rights movement, King had welcomed desegregation's progress in the United States, but lamented, quote, I've come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house. When Belafonte asked, what should we do? King replied, I guess we're going to have to become firemen. Looking across the globe, King also saw the world house ablaze from the fire of racism. He remained resolute in his belief that nonviolence could be the powerful healing water that would extinguish those flames. Racism inevitably devolved into violence. And again, King saw violence as a barrier to human community. These connections appeared to be on King's mind when, on the last day of his life, he told his brother, Alfred Daniel King, that he planned to deliver a sermon entitled, quote, Why America May Go to Hell. In 1961, King had explained to Ebony magazine that, and I quote, I do not believe in hell as a place of literal burning fire. Hell, to me, is a condition of being out of fellowship with God. It is man's refusal to accept the grace of God, unquote. The United States, Western civilization's primary power, continued to permit racism to drive a wedge between it and God. Its neocolonialism and support of apartheid made that gap wider each day. Western nations, in King's view, were then at a crossroads. Like the prodigal son, they could select the path home or stray further from grace. If they chose the latter, the decision might finally tip Western civilization's center of mass in the moral universe toward a fall from which it could not recover. Again, King said, and I quote, if Western civilization does not now respond constructively to the challenge to banish racism, some future historian will have to say that a great civilization died because it lacked the soul and commitment to make justice a reality for all men, unquote. To have a future, the Western world, he concluded, would have to repent and then be reborn not as an empire, but as a genuine community that accepted the truth that all humanity had worth. Life anew was the answer, and love was the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. Now we'll turn to Dr. Crystal de Gregory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crawford. Dr. Rivers, I'm proud to claim you as a peer mentee. I'm not certain that Dr. Baldwin would be so happy to claim me as a patient advisee, but alas, this is the work that we must do. This chapter, of course, entitled Sexism in the World, House Women and the Global Vision of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was co-written by Dr. Louis V. Baldwin and myself. Of all of the chapters that must be written, this may have been the most challenging in terms of our long legacy of Dr. King, for all of his many great gifts. Advocating against sexism in general and toward Black women in particular was something that he struggled with throughout the course of his life and career. The poet Joan Jordan said, "His or her is a careful distinction peculiar to our time, and Dr. King died before a movement emerged to include the existence of women in every thought, pretending to be profound." So what is it that we really know about Dr. King and his relationship and attitudes towards women in general and to Black women in particular? This chapter explores King's sexist and chauvinist tendencies and how they informed his global vision and his efforts to translate that vision into practical reality. We must begin, however, with the premise that King's lifelong belief in separate gender roles was a very important and determining factor in his attitude towards relationships with women. And then the discussion turned to the ways in which his experiences with women in the civil rights movement in the United States mirrored his attitude toward women and the human rights crusade worldwide. It includes some of his most provocative statements as a public figure about women and their impact on the human condition, and also explores his relationships with female activists and admirers, supporters from various parts of the globe, to the absence of his attention to sexism and the overall status of women in his articulation of and efforts to bring his World House vision to fruition. In the section called A Divided Humanity, the question of separate domains for men and women, you find that Martin Luther King Jr. came out of a family background that encouraged concerns for the struggles of the oppressed worldwide, whether or not his father, Martin Luther King Sr., and mother, Alberta Williams King, saw sexism as a part of the struggles that needed to be mediated as much as racism, colonialism, and poverty in other parts of the world remains to be seen. They were well-educated people for their time, whether Black or white. Also, having traveled abroad internationally, had an opportunity to see the world in ways in which the average rank and file American, whether white or Black, had not seen. But their early interest in liberation and empowerment of the oppressed did not extend to women and the global structures that subjugated them in terms of power and of status. So gender inequality was almost never a real serious topic of discussion for uh, Martin Luther King Jr. In his rearing, in his family life, in his church life, and not even in his education in college and seminary. It really was not until he met this young fine thing, Coretta Scott, who was an Alabama native in 1952, while they were both studying in Boston, that King would begin to learn a thing or two about women and about this particular woman, and many of her ideas would become, I think, a positive influence on who King was and would be and remains for us even today. Coretta Scott, like most Black women, did recognize the presence of sexism, did recognize the way in which it disadvantaged women, and Black women in particular, but like most Black women, had made the decision that the struggle for gender equality was slim to none against much larger for Black freedom, justice, and equality. King had made it clear that he wanted a wife who, would fit in the South, in the Southern church to which he belonged. And Coretta Scott pretty much went along with it. They both agreed on the family parent structure was the best way. But King had still very rigid ideas about male roles and women's roles in the home and in the family. And he thought that, it was primarily a woman's job to be a caretaker and nurturer, and that women naturally did those things better than men. It was Coretta who would push the button and push back against him. And some of his more progressive statements on women are believed to either have been co-authored by Coretta, who would help him write his sermons, and if not, at the very least, very much influenced by her presence in his life. Now, King was not misogynistic. He believed in the value and maybe virtue of womanhood, but also in the intelligence and the potentiality of women. He knew that well from the women in his family. He knew that well in the woman that he chose to marry. In the section named Women's Rights and Human Rights, King and the Female Sphere of Activity, we know that King had very clear examples of women's ability to do all things. He may have been a little slow to meddling on it, but what we now know of every major movement for civil rights in this country, certainly of King's era, we know that women, if not led the charge, were certainly behind the charge, keeping the charge going, powering the charge ahead. And so no one needed to tell King about the abilities of women. I think just like most men, he just benefited from male privilege and kind of enjoyed it to the degree to which he didn't see much good in dismantling a system that wasn't hurting him in any way. I do want to acknowledge that the chapter does acknowledge King's propensity for extramarital affairs. We do acknowledge that it is likely a sign that King's espoused virtue was not always matched by his activities. And that even though, to the best of our knowledge, these relationships were consenting adults, one must think that they do indicate something larger is being said. One, about King as as being human, as we all are, but also as a man who has a certain kind of value for women and for his relationships um, with women. I do want to also point out that, King had no opposition to women being into the ministry, had no opposition to calling women by their professional titles, giving them the deference and respect that they had well earned. He did work with women like Eleanor Roosevelt and Lillian Smith and Dorothy Height, women who were by no means shrinking violets of any kind. But the thought that had begun a good work in him was unfortunately not finished, stolen due to an assassin's bullet. And so we will never know what King might have become, who he might have been. But what we do know is that the legions of women produced from the modern civil rights movement, as well as the example of the movement itself, set into motion the possibility for there to be a climate and a community in which the feminist movement could take place. And we well know that movement, as with every other major movement in American history, life, and culture, that it was not perfect to Black women either. But certainly, without the preceding modern civil rights movement, without King, without those whom he inspired, those women who he may have even teed off from time to time, certainly the world that we know today, the nation that we know today, a nation in which we acknowledge there has been lots of growth, but still are lots of challenges, as enunciated very clearly by the Me Too movement. But we're not where we are, but because of Dr. King, we are not where we were. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Gregory. Now we have Dr. Lewis Baldwin, who will talk about the challenges we face in the future.
First, I want to thank each of you for your very interesting, provocative comments. I am very pleased and excited to be a participant in this conversation and exchange of ideas, focusing on our book, Reclaiming the Great World House, the Global Vision of Martin Luther King Jr. I am the sole author of Chapter 12 in this volume, which is entitled Toward a Higher Global Ideal, Martin Luther King Jr., the World House, and the Challenges of Tomorrow. So much has been written in this book about Dr. King's global significance, about his significance as a global figure who thought and acted in his own time around issues ranging from white supremacy and other forms of racism to poverty and economic injustice to war and human destruction. My focus in Chapter 12 is largely on the trans-historical king, or the king beyond context, the king who remains and who will continue to be an authority, resource, and inspiration for people worldwide in this 21st century. I treat Dr. King on essentially three levels. First, how we view, honor, and celebrate him as a symbol of global citizenship and human rights advocacy. Second, I explore Dr. King as a resource for critiquing and responding to globalization. And third, I examine how future generations might constructively appropriate and apply Dr. King's key ideals and values in bringing the great world house to full realization as both an empirical reality and a global ideal. I want to speak briefly about each of these levels on which I approach Dr. King's meaning and significance. In terms of King as a symbol of global citizenship and human rights advocacy, I think it's important to note that monuments to his memory exist in countries throughout the world. In the United States, more than 900 cities have streets named for King, and countless schools, libraries, community centers, public housing developments, social service centers, bridges, statues, and other public works bear his name and image. Of equal significance are the many King memorials that exist in other parts of the world. His birthday is reportedly recognized or celebrated in some 100 countries. And a list of King memorials across the global landscape includes the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Cuba, the Martin Luther King Jr. Park in Paris and Vienna, statues that honor Dr. King in England, France, Italy, Israel, commemorative stamps issued in King's memory in India, Ghana, Liberia, Rwanda, Mexico, and the Virgin Islands. And the many children named after King in parts of Africa and the Caribbean. I focus on such honors, recognition, and memorials in my chapter as proof that Dr. King's name and image are associated today with a globalized rights culture. And I make it clear that these are not simply monuments of recognition, they are also monuments of memory, monuments of meaning, and monuments of inspiration. Because as I view them, they, by their very existence, rekindle and keep alive conversations around global human rights. They recharge calls for much needed socio-political change. And they inspire well-meaning people of different races, creeds, and colors to ascend to greater heights in the ongoing struggle against bigotry, intolerance, and injustice. My second point coursing through my chapter is that Dr. King is a rich resource for responding to and critiquing globalization. Globalization is a term used largely by economists to explain how trade and the modern global economy has connected and increased the interdependence between nations more than ever before. Globalization existed in some forms during Dr. King's lifetime, and he actually commented on some of its essential ingredients in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, in the late 1960s, though he never used the term. King repeatedly referred to modern scientific and technological revolutions and how they had led to a world of geographical oneness. And he clearly favored more international integration and cooperation through trade, access to technology and capital, and other means. But I argued that globalization, as it finds expression and practical realization today, is antithetical to much of what King had in mind when he spoke of creative, harmonious, and productive living in the world house. And I stress this point because while globalization is increasing human interconnectedness worldwide, even across once isolated societies, it has unfortunately reinforced the economic dominance of Western countries over other countries. The current trajectory of globalization, as some critics note, is not supplying the promised benefits and economic empowerment to the poor and so-called undeveloped or underdeveloped countries in parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Also, globalization seems to be working very well for Wall Street and the big multinational corporations, but not for the world's poor, or what Dr. King called the least of these. There are also indications that globalization, by stressing competitiveness in the marketplace, is contributing to group hatred and ethnic violence throughout parts of the non-Western world. And this too conflicts with King's vision of creative and harmonious living in the World House. Dr. King's vision of the World House, at its best, rejects group hatred in all forms, economic exploitation, and violence. So I conclude in my chapter that King has much to say to us today and tomorrow about the role of ethics in the face of rapid and increasing globalization. King envisioned and fought for the globalization of an ethical ideal, a world house in which the different peoples of the world look beyond their differences in terms of race, religion, culture, and political persuasion, while living together in peace. As I point out in my chapter, human dignity, brotherhood, equal opportunity, justice, and peace are key ingredients in King's World House vision. This is what King had in mind when he spoke of the globalization of an ethical ideal. The final point treated in my chapter in the book, Reclaiming the Great World House, is that we, today and in the future, have much to learn from Dr. King about how to claim or reclaim our global citizenship, and about the ideals and values we must embrace in bringing the World House to full realization as both an ethical ideal and as an empirical reality. In the last part of my chapter, which is entitled The World House as an Unfolding Conundrum, The Path Forward, I treat King's vision of the World House as both a present and future ideal in terms of the now and the not yet. And I highlight those ideals and values we might appropriate from King and apply as we bring the World House to its fullest realization and expression. King spoke specifically about what he termed a revolution of values and priorities. And he was thinking here of a heightened and more vital sense of global citizenship, the development of a richer vision of humanity's universality in an interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent world. A much-needed shift from a thing-oriented to a person-oriented society. A fresh core of globally shared values that cherish the sacredness of human life and the significance of all life-giving forms, and the creation of a sustainable culture of peacemaking and peacekeeping. I conclude my chapter in Reclaiming the Great World House with the contention that we need these ideals and values in a nation and world in which participatory and representative democracies are becoming increasingly fragile. in which democracies no longer serve the interests of a broader justice, in which hatred and incivility have become defining features of our daily lives and routines, in which political violence has become accepted and even normalized, in which all too many are co-opting the language of freedom to avoid wearing masks and becoming vaccinated, and in which so many of the old rules and standards regarding truth and truth-telling are being broken, possibly beyond repair. Finally, let me say that Dr. King symbolized and embodied a globalized rights culture in word and deed. And he also, perhaps more than anyone else in our history, gave expression to the vision and possibilities of the great world house. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Baldwin. So now we have time for some discussion. We have time for a few questions. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Rivers, and others can chime in. First question is, it appears as though we are now at another important juncture in our globalized world as we now face the pandemic, the rise of authoritarian rule and anti-democracy, along with, of course, climate change and food insecurity and so many other worldwide problems. What are some of the challenges that you think are most threatening to us right now? And how might Dr. King's framework of the World House be a resource? And we'll start with Dr. Rivers and move on to others, if you would comment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Crawford. And just to build upon what Dr. Baldwin had observed, democracy across the world is under attack. And we see attacks on democracy here in the United States. We see crises of confidence, and that many people just simply can't agree on what the facts are anymore. And that is a very big problem because democracy depends upon a well-informed public. So some of the aspects of Dr. King's work and vision that are still directly relevant today are that Dr. King prioritized and really believed in the work of implementing the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. The 14th Amendment established that anyone born or naturalized in the United States would have citizenship, along with equal protection of laws. The 15th Amendment established that the right to vote could not be denied or abridged based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the implementation, the full unabridged implementation of those two amendments were the focus of the civil rights movement and of Dr. King's work here in the United States, but they also were things that he believed were relevant to the entire world struggle in terms of expanding democracy worldwide. And so an issue that would really concern Dr. King today would be the filibuster as an obstacle to civil rights legislation. He strongly and explicitly opposed the filibuster as an obstacle to civil rights legislation. But in today's United States Senate, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, along with the Freedom to Vote Act, are currently being obstructed by the filibuster. So that's one way in which Dr. King's work, his words, and his vision of the World House continue to affect us and are relevant to us to this very day.
Dr. Baldwin, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, we're
Comment?
speaking to Dr. King's relevance for today.
Yes,
Yes, I
some
would
of
say
the
that
very.
Dr. King is quite relevant for today because he spoke truth to power. He, of course, spoke truth in the face of evil and injustice. And that means a lot today because we live in what many scholars are calling a post-truth age, where we no longer respect the old standards of truth and truth-telling. There's been a breakdown of values as they relate to truth and truth-telling. So Dr. King was a prophet of truth in his own time, and I like to view him as a trans-historical prophet of truth in our times. because I think it's very important that we tell the truth about white supremacy, that we tell the truth about poverty and economic injustice and war and human destruction. And I like to view him as a prophet of truth who is quite relevant for our time, particularly in this post-truth age.
Dr. Lee, you've written that Dr. King never separated the struggle for justice from the building of community. Can you talk a bit more about that and share with us how we might do the same in our world today?
Yes, I believe that insight is extremely important today. The reason is justice struggles these days tend to be singular, in a sense, siloed. Now, I see the validity for that, but at the same time, we need to look at the whole picture. The ultimate goal is not the triumph of one justice issue. The ultimate goal, as Dr. Baldwin and other panelists mentioned, is building the beautiful great world house where the shalom reigns. So in that aspect, I believe the communal aspect of the King's ethics is extremely important in balance with struggles for justice in various different contexts.
So I want to switch over to talk about teaching King and the ways in which we teach King in the classroom and in the community. Dr. Baldwin, you and Dr. Lee have both been teaching courses on King for more than 30 years now. Would you talk to us about how you approach King's ideas and actions in the classroom? Let's start with you, Dr. Baldwin.
Well, I always follow what I call a 5-step approach to teaching Dr. King. I begin, first of all, with his cultural roots, looking at the impact of family, church, and the larger culture on his life and development. The second step, of course, is to deal with his training, his intellectual sources and categories, his ideals. The third step, of course, is to look at how he translated certain kinds of ideals and values into practical action, practical reality in the context of his civil rights campaigns. And the fourth step, of course, is to look at Dr. King in terms of his global citizenship and the way he addressed the global realities of white supremacy, poverty and economic injustice, and war. And finally, fifth and finally, to focus on his legacy of ideals and struggle, and what we might not only learn from that, but how we might appropriate and apply certain of his ideas and values as we continue the struggle to overcome all forms of bigotry, intolerance, and injustice.
Dr. Lee?
Yes. Dr. Baldwin, I have never chance to talk about how to teach Dr. King, but my approach is also very similar to Dr. Baldwin's. So I begin with the historical background of civil rights movement, then move to the family and church background, and then King's theology and ethics, and move to especially the tripartite evils of racism, classism, and militarism. And I conclude my course with community organizing, especially examining Dr. King as a grand community organizer that's, epitomized by the great world house. So for me, the idea of beloved community world house, it is the fulfillment sort of his entire organizing work. He dreamed as an eschatological vision. But at the same time, as I'm teaching at the seminary, I try very hard to compare King with the different kinds of Christianity practiced today in America and other parts of the world. And for example, the conservative evangelicals and white nationalists, or even progressive, the liberal Christians, because King's the conviction, belief in the God, church, as well as his spirituality, is so important as an undergirding power, his own personal agency. And also, I make a comparison between King's ethics with the secular liberal ethics of today. So I'm posing King as a alternative, constructive alternative to conservative evangelicals and secular liberal ethics.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Baldwin, you've made quite a bit of headway in terms of being influential in King's studies. Talk with us a little bit about what you see as the future of King's studies. What new directions are we moving in?
Well, I think there are a number
Scholarship.
of points I can make in response to that question. First of all, the late Dr. Rufus Burr and I talked a lot about the need for a major book-length treatment of Dr. King by a woman scholar. No woman has written a major book-length manuscript on Dr. King. And of course, we do know that there is a womanish genre in King scholarship. People like Tracy West and others have written about Dr. King, but that, I think, is one area that needs further exploration. Also, I think there are certain ideas of Dr. King. We need to treat him more seriously as an intellectual, as a man of ideals. No book exists on his ideas about God, his conception of the Holy Spirit, his views on Christ. We need those kinds of studies. Also, we need a major study of Dr. King's work at Morehouse College and Boston University. A book has been published on the Crozer years, but the Morehouse College experience needs to be treated, and also Dr. King's Boston years. I would also say that a major study of how Dr. King related to other clergy persons, not only in the church but in the movement, we could benefit very much from that. Because Dr. King he always said, first and foremost, a spiritual leader, and his civil rights leadership was an extension of his spiritual leadership. So I think we need a serious study of him as a preacher, as a pastor, as a spiritual leader, and that hasn't been done yet. And these are some of the areas that I think that call for further exploration. We have articles, essays, but no major book-length manuscripts on these subjects.
So thank you. We have time for one final question, and everyone can come in on this one. Dr. King used nonviolence to build cosmopolitan citizens of the World House. He believed that nonviolent resistance involved not only political action, but also a collective moral practice, that this practice allows us as human beings to refuse to harm others. Could you all talk with us about this idea about nonviolent resistance? And do you think it would be useful in our world today? Would it even be possible on a wide scale? Dr. Lee, you want to get us started?
Yes. Yeah, I completely affirm the value of nonviolence, especially as we now living in a highly globalized world. Beyond just the butterfly effect that people are talking about, I believe violence always has consequences and ramifications that goes beyond our immediate political calculation. So I understand the anger and even rage, against these entrenched injustices. But I think King was deeply understood the long-term destructive effect of violence on both the use of violence as well as the targets of the violence. But at the same time, I want to expand this idea of nonviolence to in a more global realm, especially me as a Korean American with root in the Asian cultural and religious tradition. The nonviolence is highly valued especially in Buddhism and the Taoism. So we need a deep interreligious, intercultural dialogue on nonviolence. That's the way we build Great World House. At the same time, expand Dr. King's idea of nonviolence. So the bottom line is nonviolence is not just a political practice or not even a moral exercise. It needs to be deeply, deeply rooted in the spirituality of different religions. By doing that, I believe we begin to see that what kind of fruit it could bear, not only in the political realm, but in the education of next generation, as well as building and moral formation of our moral character and moral virtues.
Mm-hmm. That's a brilliant point by Dr. Lee. In one of his last books, The Trumpet of Conscience, Dr. King challenged us to move beyond an intellectual analysis of nonviolence to an experimentation with nonviolence in every field of human conflict, interpersonal relations, intergroup relations, and international relations. He understood in his own time that nonviolence had been used or employed successfully, not only in the United States, but in India and in parts of Africa, in the anti-colonial struggles. So he called upon us in the Trumpet of Conscience to move beyond an intellectual analysis of nonviolence, to actually practically apply it, excuse me, in every field of human conflict, international relations, interpersonal relations, and intergroup relations. And I think that's very important.
Yes, it's very important to try to understand nonviolence, not just as a tactic, but as a philosophy as well. When I was at Vanderbilt, I had the opportunity to take a course on the nonviolent struggle from Professor James N. Lawson Jr. And one very fascinating concept that he emphasized in that course was that nonviolence is every bit as much of a science of social change as military science. And so, especially in this day and age in which many Americans are frustrated with the gridlock in the political process, the lack of outcomes for issues such as voting rights that are near and dear to so many African Americans, still boycotts and selective buying campaigns are options that can perhaps help to move the wheels of the political process in the direction in which we want them to go. But Dr. King and others who really studied and accepted nonviolence as a philosophy of life want us to understand nonviolence on a spiritual level. Because if it's simply used as a tactic, just as an option for gaining power, then there's the possibility of it being abused. So nonviolence, to Dr. King, always had to have spiritual and ethical grounding in order to truly be able to contribute to building and maintaining the world house.
Yes.
I think
Thank you
this
for that.
is the great division of the modern civil rights movement. We know that there were many observants who accepted nonviolence as a way of life, many others who accepted it as a tactic. And so we have a duality of the ways in which nonviolence played out to bring about, to force social and political change. And as much as it could be made in this country in a generation, I do think that there's an important distinction between nonviolence as a way of life and nonviolence as a tactic. principally because when nonviolence is employed as a tactic, it comes with other tactics, like Black respectability, for example, like a preoccupation with white gaze or whomever the opposition is, their gaze on your campaign and on your personhood. And I do think that that does chip away, that does erode at the soul at a certain point. And so it is my hope that, those who observe nonviolence do so for their own personhood, do so for their own soul. And we know that collectively we will benefit and collectively that we will be better because of it, but that it is not simply exercised in order to make or force change in someone else's behavior, but rather in one's own.
So we could really keep going on that question of nonviolence, but we're running out of time. And I want to conclude, and I want to first of all thank all of you for joining me this evening. I think it's been a very rich conversation about our book. The book is out now. It came out in 2019. You can purchase it. It's published by University of Georgia Press. I want to thank you, colleagues, for joining me. And I also want to thank Morehouse College. And I want to thank those of you who have tuned in this evening for our book talk. Thank you so much, and good evening.